The voicemail light on my desk wasn't just blinking, it was screaming. It was a rhythmic pulse of neon red cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, keeping time with the pounding in my head. "I know you're in there, Johnson." Marcia Wayne's voice distorted through the speaker, pitched at a frequency that could peel paint. Outside, she was shaking the chain link fence, the rattle of metal on metal sounding like a cage full of disturbed animals. "You have 10 minutes to move these monstrosities, or I will personally see to it that you never work in this state again." I didn't answer. I just sat in the dark, watching the sunrise hit the corrugated walls of the labyrinth I had built. From my window, the yard looked like a graveyard of giants. 60 trailers stood in a silent, interlocking grid, arranged with a surgical precision that turned our lot into an impenetrable fortress. Deep inside that steel tomb sat Marcia's white Range Rover and half the cars of the Whispering Pines HOA. They had spent months treating my yard like a personal parking annex, ignoring every sign and every warning. They thought proximity gave them power. I took a slow sip of scalding coffee. Outside, Marcia's valet in the red joined her at the gate, her face a mask of disbelief. She wasn't blowing me a kiss today. She was finally realizing that Atlas Freight didn't run on neighborly spirit. It ran on mass. I opened my ledger to a fresh page. I had 3 days of holiday shutdown ahead of me and a yard full of steel that didn't know how to apologize. How we got to this point is a long story, but like every bad delivery, it started with a single, misplaced item. Today's story is from Dave Johnson, a man who sees the world not in personality or politics, but in the unwavering logic of weight and volume. As a veteran logistics manager for Atlas Freight, Dave has spent decades ensuring that 500 trucks move with the precision of a Swiss watch, driven by the belief that a boundary isn't just a line on a map, it's the only thing keeping chaos from the door. Before we dive in, if you like stories like this, smash that like button now, comment below on where you're listening from, and what you would have done if you were in Dave's situation. Would you have let the residents of the HOA get their cars at Christmas? Would you have just charged a release fee? Or would you have gone with the nuclear option like Dave did? Leave your thoughts below. But now let's hear Dave's story as told in his own words. "I lived by a simple rule. Everything has a place, and every place has a rule. For 15 years, I've worked logistics at Atlas Freight, a 45-acre engine of diesel, hydraulic fluid, and reinforced steel that never truly sleeps. My name is Dave, and I'm a man who finds a strange, quiet peace in the precision of a well-organized yard. To me, a boundary isn't a suggestion or a philosophical debate. It's a structural necessity. If a 48-foot trailer is parked 6 inches over a yellow line, the entire system stutters. If a gate is left unlatched, the rhythm of the facility breaks. Everything in my world is measured in tons, feet, and minutes. But the residents of Whispering Pines didn't believe in rhythms, at least not ours. The subdivision hadn't just appeared, it had encroached, creeping up on our eastern perimeter over the last decade like a slow-moving, manicured fog. When I first started at Atlas, our auxiliary lot, a vast stretch of gravel and cracked asphalt used for staging empty containers, was buffered by nearly half a mile of silent woods. It was a no man's land of scrub oak and pine that separated industrial reality from the rest of the world. Back then, the only sounds were the distant hiss of air brakes and the occasional owl. Then came the developers. Then came the executive estate homes with their triple-car garages, faux stone facades, and names like the Hawthorne and the Majestic. By the time Marcia Wayne was elected HOA president, the woods had been razed, replaced by a wall of white picket fences that stood like tiny, arrogant teeth pressed right against our chain-link perimeter. They had built their dreams on the very edge of our reality, and then had the audacity to be offended that we existed. I remember the exact morning the invisible line finally dissolved. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of morning where the air is crisp enough to make your lungs ache, and the coffee in your mug steams like a hard-working freight engine. I was at my usual post, leaning against the scratched plexiglass window of the raised security shack, watching the first light of the sun catch the corrugated sides of the trailers. That's when I saw the silver Mercedes. It didn't hesitate at the entrance. It didn't slow down to look for a gate code, a guest pass, or a security guard. The driver simply turned off the public road with a fluid, practiced motion, sliding right past our weathered sign, the one with the faded red letters screaming "Private Property, Authorized Vehicles Only." and glided into a prime spot right next to our main staging lane. It looked absurd. A sleek, $60,000 piece of German engineering clinging like a silver parasite to the side of a dirty, gravel-stained great whale. A woman hopped out, dressed in the kind of expensive neon leggings that were designed for looking at a gym rather than actually using one. She adjusted a rolled-up yoga mat under her arm, clicked her key fob with a chirpy, self-assured beep beep, and began a light jog toward the Whispering Pines trailhead. She didn't offer a single glance at the half-million-square-foot warehouse behind her or the caution-wide turn signs posted every 20 feet. To her, we weren't a high-stakes logistics hub moving millions of dollars in essential goods. We were community overflow. We were a convenience she felt entitled to use because she had to look at us. I opened my ledger and recorded the plate number, the make, and the timestamp. 6:14 a.m. Silvermark. Unauthorized. My hand didn't shake, but I felt a familiar, deep-seated tightening in my chest. In logistics, you learn early that a small obstruction at the start of a chain creates a massive, expensive wreckage at the end of it. A car in a staging lane today meant a driver missing a window tomorrow. It was a crack in the foundation. I looked out past the car toward the subdivision. Most of the houses were still dark, their owners tucked away in climate-controlled safety, but I could see a silhouette standing on a second-story balcony 3 houses down. Even from a distance, the posture was unmistakable. It was Marcia Wayne. She was draped in a silk robe the color of a fresh bruise, a coffee cup in one hand, looking down at our yard. She wasn't just watching the jogger. She was watching me. She was testing the fence, gauging my reaction, waiting to see if the lifestyle of Whispering Pines could finally overwrite the industrial permits of Atlas Freight. She had been campaigning for months to have our unsightly trailers moved further from the property line, and now she was moving her pawns into the space we left behind. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, the heat grounding me. I knew the type. People like Marcia don't just take an inch. They wait for you to blink so they can claim the entire mile and then try to charge you rent for walking on it. She thought she was playing a game of social chicken. She thought that because her world was made of committee meetings and aesthetic standards, she could dictate the movement of steel and stone. The balance of the yard was off. The rules were being ignored. And in my world, when things are out of place, gravity eventually demands a correction. I closed the ledger with a soft thud. The war hadn't been declared yet, but the first scout had crossed the line. The silver Mercedes was still cooling in the lot when the front office door chimed at exactly 8 a.m. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of a driver carrying a manifest. It was a sharp, impatient rap against the glass that sounded like a woodpecker with a grievance. I didn't even have to look up from my monitor to know who was standing there. Marcia Wayne didn't just enter a room. She attempted to colonize it. She marched into the Atlas Freight front office wearing a power blazer the color of a desert sunset and carrying a designer clipboard like a tactical shield. The air in the room, usually smelling of stale coffee and diesel exhaust, was suddenly overwhelmed by a cloud of perfume that smelled like expensive lilies and unearned authority. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice landing somewhere between a royal decree and a sharp reprimand. She didn't wait for me to acknowledge her. She didn't even say hello. "We need to have a serious conversation about the visual pollution currently emanating from this facility." I leaned back in my swivel chair, which let out a long, tired groan that perfectly matched my internal state. "Good morning to you too, Marcia. And by visual pollution, I assume you mean the trailers that have been parked on this land since 1994? She bristled, her eyes narrowing as she scanned my desk, lingering with visible disgust on my world's okayest logistics manager mug. "Don't be obtuse, David. It's a matter of community standards. Whispering Pines is a premier residential enclave. We have a gala coming up in December, the winter solstice celebration, and our guests will be driving past your entrance. Having those rusted industrial boxes sitting right against the property line is simply unacceptable. It's an eyesore. It's unneighborly." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see a small nerve jump in her jaw. "The trailers stay where the freight flow dictates, Marcia. That's how logistics works. And speaking of unneighborly, there's a silver Mercedes currently taking up a staging slot in my yard. I assume she's one of yours?" Marcia didn't even blink. Instead, she offered a thin, shark-like smirk. "Oh, that would be Mrs. Gable. She's the head of our beautification committee. She's simply using the empty space while she accesses the nature trail." Surely Atlas Freight can spare a few square feet of dirt for a woman contributing to the local ecosystem? Or are you as rigid as your scheduling software? It's not empty space, Marcia. It's a transition zone for 40-ton rigs. If a driver comes in hot and has to swerve because Mrs. Gable is stretching her hamstrings in a blind spot, her beautification is going to get real messy real fast. Marcia stepped closer, leaning over my desk. The lilies were suffocating now. Listen to me carefully, David. You are an anachronism. This town is changing. People want hiking trails and organic bistros, not soot and gear grinding at 3 in the morning. We are already in talks with the city council about noise ordinances and aesthetic zoning. You can either work with us, starting with providing some community overflow parking, or you can find out exactly how much it costs to fight a unified HOA with a direct line to the mayor's office. She wasn't just asking for a favor, she was testing a theory. She believed that if she shouted loud enough and used words like vision and standards, the legal reality of private property would simply melt away. She looked at me not as a professional, but as a stubborn janitor standing in the way of her manifest destiny. The lot is for authorized vehicles only, I said, my voice flat and final. I've been polite about it for months, but the signs are going to start being enforced. Marcia straightened her blazer, her expression shifting from irritation to a cold, petty kind of triumph. We'll see about that. I've already told the residents that you've informally agreed to support the neighborhood's growth. If you start towing cars now, David, you won't just be a nuisance, you'll be a villain. And I am very, very good at casting the lead role in a public shaming. She turned on her heel and marched out, the door chimes sounding like a funeral knell behind her. Through the window, I watched her walk past the private property sign. She didn't just ignore it. She actually reached out and flicked a speck of dust off the corner of the metal, a gesture so small and so arrogant it made my blood run cold. I looked back at my ledger. The silver Mercedes was still there, and now I could see two more SUVs pulling in behind it, the drivers waving to Marcia as she headed toward her Range Rover. The queen of the cul-de-sac had made her move. She thought she was playing a game of social chicken, but she had forgotten one fundamental truth about Atlas Freight. We don't move for anything. We are the ones who do the moving. The petty war officially began 48 hours later. It started on the screen before it hit the pavement. I was finishing a late shift manifest when my phone chimed with a notification from a buddy who lived 3 streets over from the subdivision. He sent me a link to the Whispering Pines Community Voice Facebook group. At the top of the feed, pinned for maximum visibility, was a photo of me standing by the security gate, caught in a grainy zoom that made me look like a disgruntled gargoyle. The caption, written by Marcia herself, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive fiction. Met today with Atlas Freight's logistics manager. Sadly, it seems our industrial neighbors are more interested in rusted steel than community safety. They've refused to discuss shared parking solutions and even threatened our residents. Is this the kind of corporate bully we want in our backyard? Hashtag protect Whispering Pines, hashtag community first. The comments section was a shark tank. They wake up my kids at 4 a.m., one person wrote. I saw a driver glare at my poodle, claimed another. Marcia was in the thick of it, liking every grievance and steering the conversation toward a planned protest. By Friday, the digital vitriol turned physical. Marcia didn't just encourage the parking, she weaponized it. She organized a trailhead appreciation morning, which was really just code for a coordinated blockade. When I arrived for my 6 a.m. shift, the auxiliary lot was already half full. It wasn't just the usual morning joggers anymore. There were minivans, SUVs with HOA board member stickers, and even a vintage convertible that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a gravel yard. I stepped out of the shack to put up the lot full chain, but a woman in a screamingly bright red jacket, one of Marcia's lieutenants, was already standing there. She had her SUV angled perfectly to block the gate from closing. "You can't park here, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level. "We have a delivery of 60 empty containers arriving in 20 minutes. I need this lane clear." She didn't even look at me. She just adjusted her sunglasses and pointed to a fresh, laminated sign she had taped underneath our official one. It read, "Official Whispering Pines Overflow, by order of the HOA." Marcia said it was fine, she chirped. She said you were reconsidering your stance. It's about being a good neighbor, David. Don't be a Grinch. She locked her car and jogged away toward the trail. 10 minutes later, a line of 3 Atlas rigs appeared on the horizon, their chrome grills glinting in the morning light. They slowed to a crawl. unable to make the wide turn into the staging lanes because of the blockade. The air filled with the low, rhythmic thrum of idling diesel engines, a sound that usually meant money, but today meant trouble. I called the local tow company we'd used for a decade. The owner, a guy named Mike, who'd pulled us out of every winter jam since the 90s, sounded exhausted. "Dave, I can't do it," Mike sighed. "Marcia Wayne has been calling the city council every 10 minutes. She's filed a civil harassment injunction against our trucks entering that specific lot. My lawyer told me to stay clear until the zoning board sorts it out. She's playing dirty, man." I looked out the window. Marcia was standing on her balcony again, holding a pair of binoculars. She wasn't even pretending to be subtle anymore. She saw the trucks backing up, saw the drivers climbing out of their cabs to look at the mess, and she actually waved. It was a taunt. She was proving that she could stop the unstoppable engine of Atlas Freight with nothing more than a Facebook group and a few well-placed SUVs. Every time a driver honked in frustration, Marcia's phone probably lit up with a fresh noise complaint to the police. She was creating the very chaos she claimed to despise, all to force us into a corner where we'd have to beg for her mercy. I went back inside, opened my ledger, and started a fresh page. I didn't engage. I didn't shout. I just watched. I watched the woman in the red jacket return to her car 3 hours later, glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had won. I watched the way they moved through our space as if the ground itself had surrendered. Marcia thought she was winning the war of optics. She thought that by clogging the pipes, she could make us pay the toll. But she didn't understand the first rule of logistics. When a system is blocked, you don't push harder against the obstruction. You wait for the moment the system stops moving entirely. Because once everything stands still, the rules of the game change. By the middle of December, the lot didn't even look like part of Atlas Freight anymore. It looked like a luxury car showroom that had been hit by a gravel storm. The woman in the red jacket had become a permanent fixture, acting as a sort of unofficial valet for the Whispering Pines residents, directing them to the best spots while our drivers were forced to stage trailers 3 miles down the road at a rented depot. The cost was mounting. We were losing time, losing fuel, and most importantly, losing the patience of our crews. In the office, management was vibrating with a mixture of rage and defeat. The legal department was buried under a mountain of Marcia's frivolous cease and desist filings regarding everything from the dust our tires kicked up to the aggressive look of our chain link fence. "We have to give them something, Dave." My boss, Miller, groaned as he stared at a photo Marcia had sent to the local news. It showed a mother pushing a stroller past one of our idling rigs, captioned, "Industrial giants threaten our children." Maybe we just pave a small section for them? Dedicate a dozen spots to the HOA to keep the peace? "Give an inch, they take the mile," I said, my eyes fixed on the office calendar. "If you give Marcia Wayne a dozen spots, she'll be asking for a gazebo and a fountain by Easter." I wasn't looking at the days of the week. I was looking at the operational windows. Atlas Freight was a machine, and like any machine, it had a reset button. Christmas Eve fell on a Wednesday that year. Usually, the holidays were a headache of last-minute shipping rushes, but this year, the board had decided on a total tactical reset. To save on overhead and give the drivers a real break, Atlas was shutting down completely. From the afternoon of the 23rd until the morning of the 27th, the gates would be locked. No dispatch, no inbound, no outbound. Just the skeleton security crew and the silent weight of 500 trailers. It was a 4-day vacuum. And in a vacuum, space becomes a very powerful thing. On the 22nd, I saw Marcia in the lot. She wasn't jogging or valeting. She was holding a clipboard, standing next to a surveyor's transit. She was actually measuring the distance from our staging lanes to the Whispering Pines property line. I walked out to the fence. "Planning an addition, Marcia?" She looked up, her eyes bright with a predatory sort of glee. "I'm documenting the optimal use of this land, David. The city's planning committee is very interested in our proposal for a buffer park. Since you clearly don't need this space for trailers half the time, we think it would be better served as a community green space with a dog run." "A dog run on an industrial site," I remarked. "That's a lot of liability for a golden retriever." "Oh, the liability will be yours," she chirped, clicking her pen. "But don't worry. We'll be sure to send you an invite to the ribbon cutting. I hear you're closing up for the holidays? How lovely. It'll give the residents a chance to enjoy the peace and quiet of our new parking annex without your noisy trucks in the way." She knew we were shutting down. She'd probably read our corporate holiday schedule on the public notice board. She saw the shutdown as a surrender, a white flag that gave her 3 days of undisputed territory. She was already telling her neighbors to use the lot for their holiday guests. "Park at Atlas," she'd posted on the Facebook group. "They're closed, and they can't do a thing about it." I went back inside and checked the yard map. I knew exactly where our dead trailers, the 48-footers that were out of service for maintenance, were staged. I knew which yard dogs were fueled up and ready. Miller came by my desk, putting on his coat. "I'm heading out, Dave. You sure you don't mind handling the final yard positioning? It's a lot of shuffling for one night." "I don't mind at all," I said, my voice as flat as a stretch of Kansas highway. "I want to make sure everything is exactly where it belongs for the long weekend. Security starts at 6. I'll be done by 10. "Good man. Merry Christmas, Dave." "Merry Christmas, Miller." I watched his car pull out. Then I watched the sun begin to dip behind the faux stone chimneys of Whispering Pines. One by one, the holiday guests began to arrive. SUVs packed with presents, sedans carrying grandparents, cars with out-of-state plates, all of them following Marcia's directions. They flowed into our lot, parking with a reckless holiday cheer, filling every available gap between our staging lines. Marcia's white Range Rover took the throne, the spot right at the back, furthest from the gate, guarded on 3 sides by our heavy equipment. She got out, wearing a coat with a fur collar, and looked up at my window. She didn't wave this time. She just smiled, a cold, victorious expression that said the land was hers. I waited until her house lights flickered on. I waited until the lot was a dense thicket of unauthorized metal. Then I put down my coffee, picked up the keys to the yard dog, and stepped out into the cold, quiet air. It was time to put things in their place. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the gravel lot into a floor of iron. I climbed into the cab of the yard dog, the stubby, powerful tractor designed for one thing: moving heavy steel in tight spaces. The engine turned over with a deep, guttural roar that felt like a physical weight in the silent yard. Marcia and her followers thought they understood space. They saw an open lot as a blank canvas for their convenience. But I understood volume. I understood that 48 feet of reinforced steel doesn't just occupy space, it commands it. I started at the back, near the property line, where Marcia's white Range Rover sat like a crown jewel. She had parked it with intentional defiance, angled across 2 of our staging lanes. I backed the yard dog up to a line of empty, out-of-service trailers. The airlines hissed as I connected them, a sharp, mechanical breath in the dark. Clack. Shh. The kingpin locked. I moved the first trailer. I didn't park it where it usually went. Instead, I positioned it 3 inches from Marcia's front bumper. Then I fetched another. This one went parallel to her driver's side door, leaving exactly 2 inches of clearance, just enough to ensure she couldn't even slide a credit card into the gap, let alone open the door. I worked with a rhythmic, surgical focus. For the next 4 hours, the yard dog was an extension of my own hands. I wasn't just shuffling equipment. I was weaving a tapestry of industrial weight. I brought in the heavy-duty reefers and the long-haul dry vans, placing them in staggered rows. I built corridors that led nowhere. I created steel cul-de-sacs. I positioned 50-ton boxes to block every possible exit path, aligning them with such precision that the lot transformed from a parking area into a windowless, impenetrable labyrinth. From the road, it looked like a standard holiday staging. From the inside, it was a tomb of high-tensile steel. I was careful. I never touched a single car. I didn't scratch a fender or smudge a window. I treated their precious property with a cold, professional distance. I simply placed my property, Atlas Freight property, where it had every legal right to be. By 10 p.m., the job was done. 60 trailers were locked down, their air brakes set with a final, echoing thud. Marcia's Range Rover, Mrs. Gable's silver Mercedes, and the woman in the bright red jacket's SUV were all buried deep within the maze. They were boxed in by walls of corrugated metal 8 feet wide and 13 feet high. I climbed down from the cab, my joints stiff from the cold. The silence that followed the engine's cutoff was absolute. There were no more chirpy key fobs, no more yoga mat joggers, no more community overflow. There was only the smell of diesel and the sight of a steel fortress. I walked the perimeter one last time, my breath blooming in the moonlight. I looked up at the houses of Whispering Pines. The lights were warm and glowing. I could see the flicker of Christmas trees through the windows. They were in there celebrating their victory, oblivious to the fact that they had just been designed out of their own mobility. I reached the security shack, handed the master keys to the night guard, a quiet guy named Pete who had watched the whole thing with a slow, growing grin, and checked the gate lock. "Anything I should know for the shift, Dave?" Pete asked, his voice hushed. "The yard is secured," I said, zipping up my parka. "The inventory is exactly where it needs to be for the shutdown. If anyone calls about their cars, just tell them the truth. The yard is closed, the equipment is locked, and we'll see them on the 27th. I drove out of the lot, passing the sign Marcia had defaced earlier that day. In the dark, the words private property seemed to glow. She wanted the lot to be part of the community. Well, for the next 3 days, her community was going to be exactly 48 feet long and made of steel. Christmas morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, cold, pale, and utterly indifferent to the festivities below. I woke up at 7, the house silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator, but I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't need to. I already knew what the digital airwaves over Whispering Pines would sound like. I took my time, brewing a pot of coffee and watching the frost crawl across my own windows, appreciating the stillness that only comes once a year. By the time I reached my sister's house, the smell of pine needles and roasting ham had begun to fill the kitchen. My nephew was sprawled on the rug, crashing plastic trucks into each other with joyful abandon, oblivious to the high-stakes game of Tetris I had played the night before. Around 9:30 a.m., while the rest of the family was distracted by the opening of stockings, I finally pulled my phone from my pocket. It felt hot, vibrating with the frantic, stored-up energy of a hive of disturbed wasps. 87 missed calls, 214 text messages, 3 dozen voicemail alerts. I bypassed the personal messages and went straight to the source of the meltdown, the Whispering Pines Community Voice Facebook group. The festive holiday header, a digital wreath with peace on earth, had been buried under a landslide of digital screaming. Marcia had posted her first update at 7:45 a.m., and the descent into total communal madness was documented in breathless, panicked real time. "Urgent. Atlas Freight has blocked the lot," her first post read, the font large and desperate. "My car is trapped. This is illegal. This is kidnapping. Does anyone have a torch? I can't even see my Range Rover behind these walls. Someone, call the police." Below her post, the Trailhead Appreciation Group had mutated into a frantic mob. Mrs. Gable was posting in all caps because she couldn't get her silver Mercedes out for a 10 a.m. brunch in the city. The woman in the neon red jacket, Marcia's loyal valet, was threatening to call the National Guard, claiming that elderly residents were being held hostage by industrial machinery. There were photos, grainy, panicked shots taken from ground level by people who had wandered into the maze in their slippers. The images showed nothing but towering walls of white, gray, and rust-streaked steel. The narrow gaps I had left between trailers looked like the lightless entrances to a prehistoric cavern. I clicked on a video someone had uploaded. It was Marcia. She was still in her silk robe, now covered by her fur-collared coat, her hair a wild mess in the wind. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, her skin a mottled purple from the cold. She was standing at our chain-link fence, shaking the locked gate with both hands, her designer rings clattering against the metal. "I know you're listening, Johnson," she shrieked into the camera, her voice cracking and thin in the sub-zero air. "You open this gate right now. This is a civil rights violation. I have a lawyer on speed dial. You're going to jail for this. Do you hear me? I'll have your badge, or whatever it is you people have. This is my land." I put the phone face down on the granite counter and took a slow, steady sip of water. The "my land" comment was the icing on the cake. She still didn't get it. Around 11 a.m., Pete, the security guard I'd left on the skeleton shift, sent me a short, professional text that read like a battlefield dispatch. Police arrived at 10:15, 2 officers. They walked the perimeter with Marcia Wayne. She was screaming about grand larceny and unlawful imprisonment. One officer looked at the trailers, checked our land survey and the private property signs on the gate, and told her it was a civil matter on private property. He actually told her she was lucky we weren't charging her for trespassing yet. They left 5 minutes ago. Marcia is currently sitting on the gravel in front of the gate, crying and recording a Facebook Live. "Merry Christmas, Dave." I felt a small, cold spark of satisfaction, but it wasn't joy. It was the clinical feeling of a ledger finally balancing. It was the satisfaction of a bridge being built exactly to code. I went back to the dining table and picked up my carving knife. My sister looked at me, noticing the slight, distant ghost of a smile on my face. "You look incredibly peaceful today, Dave," she remarked, handing me a platter. "Did you finally get that logistics puzzle solved at work? You've been stressed about that neighbor of yours for weeks." "Just about," I said, sliding the blade through the ham with surgical precision. "Everything's exactly where it's supposed to be for once. The system is holding." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and whistling through the eaves. I thought about those cars sitting in the dark, cold heart of the steel labyrinth. In this deep freeze, the batteries would be the first things to go. The silver Mercedes, the Range Rover, the SUVs. They weren't vehicles anymore. They were becoming expensive blocks of ice, held fast by the silent, indifferent weight of Atlas freight. Marcia Wayne had spent months trying to prove that our world belonged to her. Now, she was finding out what it was like to be a guest in a world where the only language spoken was steel, volume, and law. And for the next 48 hours, nobody at Atlas was going to say a word back to her. By the morning of the 26th, the hysterical screaming had been replaced by a heavy, desperate silence. The Christmas crisis had entered its second full day, and the reality of a 3-day holiday shutdown was finally sinking into the collective consciousness of Whispering Pines. I didn't need the Facebook group to tell me the mood had shifted. I could see it in the notes. Around noon, I drove past the Atlas perimeter on my way to grab coffee. I didn't stop, but I slowed down enough to see the gate. It was no longer being shaken by a furious Marcia Wayne. Instead, it had become a makeshift bulletin board for desperation. Tape-curled sheets of paper fluttered in the freezing wind. One, written in a shaky hand on lined notebook paper, read, "Please, my daughter's inhaler is in the car. We just need 5 minutes." Another, typed in formal, attempted a different angle. "Atlas Management. We are prepared to discuss a long-term parking lease if you can provide immediate access for holiday departures. Please call." There was no number provided. They were shouting into a void they had spent months ignoring. The digital front was even more telling. The Whispering Pines community voice had turned on itself. The bravado from the Trailhead Appreciation Group had vanished, replaced by residents sniping at Marcia for her legal advice. "You told us it was public overflow, Marcia," one resident posted. "My car won't even start now, and I'm missing my flight to Florida. Who's paying for my ticket?" Marcia's responses had become increasingly erratic and petty. She was no longer posting videos. She was typing in short, bitter bursts. "I am doing everything I can. Atlas is being ruthless. This is a corporate strike against our values." But the likes weren't coming in anymore. The community had realized that values didn't move 50-ton trailers. I sat in my truck, watching the yard from the public road. The trailers stood like monoliths, casting long blue shadows across the trapped cars. It was 5 degrees out. Under those steel hulls, the silver Mercedes and the Range Rover were being drained of their life. Every hour the temperature stayed below freezing, the chemical reactions in their batteries slowed, the oil thickened, and the plastic trim groaned. Marcia appeared on her balcony, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. She looked smaller than she had 2 days ago. She was staring at the yard, probably trying to calculate if there was any gap I had missed, any weakness in the geometry. There wasn't. I had mapped that labyrinth to the inch. The most satisfying part wasn't the entrapment itself. It was the lack of an audience. No one at Atlas was answering the phones. The security guard, Pete, had been instructed to stay inside the climate-controlled shack and only roll down the window for emergency services. No negotiations. No resetting of the lines. I felt a twinge of something. Not guilt, but a recognition of the severity. I knew what it was like to need a vehicle. But then I remembered the woman in the red jacket blowing me a kiss as she blocked our loading lane. I remembered Marcia's decree of incorporation and her threats to burn the place down. The HOA had spent years treating our boundaries as suggestions. They thought respect was something they could opt into when it suited them. Now, they were learning that boundaries are self-enforcing. If you ignore the sign on the gate, eventually the gate ignores you. I pulled away from the curb, the heater in my truck finally kicking in. Tomorrow morning, the engines would start. Tomorrow, the liberation would begin. But for one more night, the steel stayed still. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, Atlas Freight was finally in total control of its own land. At 6 a.m. on the 27th, the silence of the holiday was shattered by the rhythmic, percussive thrum of 30 diesel engines turning over at once. To a logistics man, it was the sound of a heart restarting. To the residents of Whispering Pines, I imagine it sounded like the hoofbeats of an approaching army. I was back in the yard dog by 6:15 a.m. The air was so cold it felt brittle, and a thin layer of hoarfrost had turned the steel trailers into glittering white monoliths. I didn't rush. Logistics isn't about speed, it's about sequence. I began at the front gate, peeling back the outer layers of the labyrinth. As the first corridor opened, a small crowd had already gathered at the fence line. They looked like refugees, haggard, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale in the morning light. Marcia was at the front, her bruised blazer hidden under a heavy windbreaker, her eyes bloodshot. She didn't look like a queen today. She looked like someone who had spent 3 days staring at a wall. I ignored them. I moved the first 48-footer. The air brakes let out a long, defiant hiss as I dragged it toward the staging lane. One by one, the trapped cars were revealed. The exodus was pathetic. Most of the cars wouldn't start. I watched Mrs. Gable click her key fob frantically at the silver Mercedes. The car remained dead, its battery defeated by the deep freeze. The woman in the red jacket had to be jumped by a passing neighbor, her SUV coughing out a cloud of black smoke before she peeled out of the lot without looking back. Finally, I reached the Range Rover. I moved the final trailer, the one I'd parked inches from Marcia's bumper, and pulled the yard dog aside. I hopped down from the cab, the gravel crunching under my boots, and walked toward the gate to unlock it for the last time. Marcia didn't wait for me to finish. She pushed through the gate the second it swung open, marching toward me with a trembling finger pointed at my chest. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat, her voice raspy from 3 days of screaming into the wind. "You think this is over? My lawyer is filing for damages as we speak. Emotional distress, loss of use, business interference. I'm going to strip Atlas Freight of every cent it has for this stunt." I didn't answer right away. I just looked past her at the Range Rover, which was currently being hooked up to a tow truck because the electronics had fried in the cold. "The sign says private property, Marcia," I said quietly. "It's been there for 30 years. You didn't pay for the space, and you didn't have permission to be in it. We didn't touch your car. We just used our land for our equipment. You did this out of spite," she shrieked, her composure finally snapping. "You did this to humiliate me." "I did this because you wouldn't listen," I corrected her. "You mistake proximity for power, Marcia. Just because you live next to us doesn't mean you own us." She let out a sound of pure frustration, a strangled cry that died in the cold air. She realized, for the first time, that her threats had no teeth here. The Shame Atlas page, the Trailhead Appreciation Group, the mayor's office, none of it had moved a single pound of steel. As the last unauthorized car was towed or limped out of the yard, the lot felt cavernous and clean. The weight was gone. I walked back to the security shack, sensing her eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. The Great Liberation was over. We had our yard back, and for the first time in months, the lines were clear. But as I watched Marcia climb into the passenger seat of her neighbor's car, I knew her pettiness wouldn't stay buried for long. Entitlement like hers doesn't die. It just looks for a bigger shovel. For a while, the silence from Whispering Pines was beautiful. The lot stayed empty. The Facebook group went quiet, and even the woman in the red jacket started parking 3 blocks away on a public street. I thought the steel labyrinth had finally hammered the point home. I was wrong. I had forgotten that for people like Marcia Wayne, a defeat isn't a lesson. It's a debt they intend to collect with interest. The counterattack arrived on a Tuesday in late spring, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It wasn't a lawsuit for the Christmas kidnapping as we'd expected. It was something far more creative and far more delusional. I walked into Miller's office and found him staring at a thick, cream-colored document with the Whispering Pines HOA seal embossed at the top. He looked like he was trying to solve a math problem written in a dead language. "Dave," he said, holding the paper with 2 fingers like it was radioactive. "You need to read this. I think March has finally lost her mind." I took the document. It was titled Decree of Mandatory Annexation and Assessment of Infrastructure Dues. I read the first paragraph twice because I couldn't believe the brass neck of it. Marcia had convinced her board to pass a resolution stating that because Atlas Freight's auxiliary lot shared a border with Whispering Pines, and because our trucks used community-adjacent roadways, we were now formally considered a member of their homeowners association. "They're annexing us?" I asked, a short, sharp laugh escaping me. "We're an industrial-zoned freight hub. We were here before they had plumbing." "Keep reading," Miller groaned. I flipped to the second page. Under a section titled Shared Services Contribution, the HOA was demanding a monthly membership fee of $10,000. The justification was a laundry list of petty grievances: road wear, noise pollution mitigation, and a scenic vista tax to compensate the residents for having to look at our trailers. But it was the fine print that showed Marcia's true vindictiveness. It stated that as an HOA member, Atlas Freight was now subject to all Whispering Pines bylaws. That meant our trailers had to be painted in approved earth tones. Our security lights had to be dimmed after 9 p.m., and we were prohibited from storing heavy machinery in view of the public. "She's trying to fine us out of existence," I said, handing the papers back. "She's already started," Miller replied, pointing out the window. I looked out at our main gate. There, standing on the public sidewalk just outside our property line, was Marcia. She was wearing a high-visibility vest that didn't hide her designer blouse, and she was holding a digital camera and a notebook. Every time one of our rigs turned into the yard, she'd snap a photo. "She's writing bylaw violations for every truck that has mud on the tires or a mismatched logo," Miller explained. "She sent us 20 fines yesterday alone, $500 per infraction. The $10,000 monthly dues were just the baseline. The real goal was the slow, bureaucratic strangulation of our operations." She figured if she couldn't move the steel with her hands, she'd bury it under a mountain of paper and debt. She thought she could declare herself our landlord and force us to pay for the privilege of being bullied. I looked at the decree one more time. Marcia had signed it with a flourish, adding a little smiley face next to her name. It was the ultimate petty power move, the belief that she could legislate reality to fit her whims. "What's the move, Miller?" I asked. "Do we call the city?" Miller leaned back, a cold, hard glint appearing in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "No, we're done talking to the city. We're done talking to Marcia. We're handing this to the corporate legal team in Chicago. They've been looking for a reason to justify their retainers, and I think Marcia just gave them a 5-course meal." I went back to my desk and watched Marcia through the glass. She looked up and saw me, raising her camera to take a photo of the security shack. She was smiling, the same triumphant, entitled smile she'd worn before I boxed her in. She thought she'd found a way to win where the steel had failed. She didn't realize that in the world of high-stakes logistics, $10,000 a month isn't a threat. It's a paper trail. And at Atlas Freight, we never lose a paper trail. The silence from Atlas Freight over the next month wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. While Marcia Wayne spent her mornings on the sidewalk, triumphantly scribbling fines into her leather-bound notebook and mailing us invoices for $10,000 monthly dues, our corporate legal team was performing a forensic autopsy on the Whispering Pines HOA. When the court date finally arrived, it wasn't held in some small-town municipal building. It was a superior court matter, and the atmosphere was as cold and clinical as a morgue. Marcia arrived early, draped in a white wool suit that screamed purity and victimhood. She had brought a gallery of supporters: the woman in the red jacket, Mrs. Gable, and a handful of other residents who looked like they were attending a coronation. Marcia carried herself with an air of absolute certainty, her chin tilted high. She truly believed that her decree of annexation was a stroke of genius, a legal masterstroke that would finally bring the industrial giant to its knees. The HOA's lawyer, a young man who looked like he was vibrating with nervous energy, opened their case with a speech about community harmony and the uncompensated burden Atlas Freight placed on the gentle residents of Whispering Pines. He spoke of the $10,000 dues as a fair share contribution for the prestige our company gained by being adjacent to such a high-end development. I sat behind our counsel, watching the judge, a man named Holloway, who looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He listened to the HOA's opening with a face that betrayed nothing, his eyes fixed on the thick stack of bylaw violations Marcia had submitted as evidence. Then, our lead counsel, a woman from the Chicago office named Sarah Vance, stood up. She didn't give a speech about harmony. She spoke in the language of deeds, titles, and statutory law. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice a calm, lethal contrast to the HOA's emotional plea. The defendant, Atlas Freight, has operated on this land since 1994. The Whispering Pines subdivision was incorporated in 2012. We have submitted into evidence the original zoning permits, the county land use maps, and the state industrial charters. There is no legal mechanism in this state or any other that allows a residential homeowners association to unilaterally annex a pre-existing heavy industrial operation. She paused, laying a document on the judge's bench. Furthermore, the fines and dues levied by Mrs. Wayne represent a coordinated campaign of targeted harassment and tortious interference with business operations. We have documented 412 separate instances of Mrs. Wayne standing on public property to photograph our employees, as well as digital evidence of her inciting residents to block commercial loading lanes. Marcia's smile began to falter. She leaned over to whisper to her lawyer, her face reddening as Sarah continued. Atlas Freight is not a member of Whispering Pines, Sarah said, turning to look directly at Marcia. We are not subject to your earth-tone paint requirements, and we certainly do not owe you a scenic vista tax. In fact, according to the state's anti-SLAPP statutes and our filings for malicious prosecution, it is the HOA that owes Atlas Freight. The turning point came when Judge Holloway looked over his spectacles at Marcia's lawyer. Counsel, he said, his voice like gravel grinding in a mixer. Can you provide a single precedent where a residential HOA successfully levied dues against an interstate logistics hub? The young lawyer stammered. Well, Your Honor, the spirit of the community. The spirit of the community doesn't write the law, son, Holloway snapped. This decree is not a legal document. It is a fantasy. It is a work of fiction written on expensive stationery. The verdict didn't just dismiss the HOA's claims, it dismantled them. The judge ruled that the annexation was frivolous and legally void. But he didn't stop there. Because Atlas Freight had documented the lost revenue from the Christmas blockade and the administrative costs of fighting Marcia's fake fines, he found the HOA liable for harassment and business interference. I find the board of Whispering Pines has acted with a gross disregard for property law and a disturbing level of personal animosity, Holloway declared. I am awarding Atlas Freight compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of $5 million. The sound that left Marcia's throat wasn't human. It was a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Behind her, the gallery of supporters sat in a stunned, terrifying silence. The $5 million landed like a dropped shipping container, loud, final, and heavy enough to crush everything beneath it. Marcia looked at me then, her eyes wide and wild. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a janitor or a lifestyle disruption. She was looking at the man who had warned her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just closed my notebook, the same way I closed the gate at the end of a shift. The queen of the cul-de-sac had tried to tax the wind. Now, she was finding out exactly what happens when the wind decides to blow back. The $5 million judgment didn't just break the HOA's spirit, it shattered the very foundation of Whispering Pines. Because Marcia had convinced the board to authorize the legal action as a collective community initiative, the liability didn't just vanish into the corporate ether or a single insurance policy. It landed squarely on the doorsteps of the 300 homes that made up the subdivision. The fallout was immediate, visceral, and loud. I watched the transformation from my office window, the same way I had watched the first silver Mercedes cross our property line months ago. The prestige Marcia Wayne had spent years cultivating, the image of an exclusive, untouchable enclave, evaporated in a single weekend. Emergency town hall meetings were held in the park, but this time, Atlas Freight wasn't the target of the vitriol. The residents had turned on each other with a ferocity that made our legal battle look like a playground spat. From the public road, I could hear the shouting matches echoing across the manicured lawns. The $5 million meant that every household was suddenly staring down the barrel of a special assessment of nearly $17,000. For the young families in the smaller builds, it was a disaster. For the retirees, it was a threat to their life savings. Marcia didn't show her face for the first 4 days. She had become a ghost in her own kingdom. The woman in the red jacket was the first to resign from the board, followed quickly by Mrs. Gable. They weren't beautifying anything now. They were frantically scrubbing their social media profiles of every Shame Atlas post they'd ever made. desperate to distance themselves from the woman who had led them into a financial slaughterhouse. The Community Voice Facebook group was deleted entirely, replaced by a new group titled Hold the Board Accountable. On the fifth day, I finally saw her. She wasn't wearing the bruise-colored blazer or the white wool suit. She was wearing a plain, oversized gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that suggested she hadn't slept in days. She was lugging a heavy box of kitchenware out to the curb. A bright "For Sale" sign had been hammered into her lawn. Not a decorative, branded one, but a cheap, plastic one from a hardware store. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The woman who had tried to annex us for road maintenance and scenic vistas was being forced out by the very system she had tried to weaponize. Her neighbors, the people she had protected with her decrees and her vision, were now her most vocal enemies. I'd heard from Pete that someone had even spray painted the word liability in jagged red letters across her pristine driveway. A new interim HOA board was formed within the week. Their first act wasn't a decree, a demand, or a threat. It was a humble, three-sentence letter delivered by a courier who didn't even wait for a signature. It acknowledged the court's ruling with painful clarity, offered an unconditional apology for the unfortunate and unauthorized misunderstandings of the previous administration, and requested a meeting to discuss a peaceful, distant coexistence. No. $0.000 duas. No earth tone paint requirements. No lifestyle complaints. I stood by the window with a fresh cup of coffee, watching a line of Atlas rigs roll smoothly into the staging lanes. The rhythm of the yard was perfect. There were no protesters, no cameras, no Marcia Wayne standing on the sidewalk with a clipboard, pretending to be a guardian of the peace. The lot was ours again. Not because we had fought for it with shouting and social media posts, but because we had stood our ground with the cold, immovable weight of the law and the patience of people who know how to wait for a delivery. I watched Marcia pull out of her driveway for the last time. She didn't look at the warehouse. She didn't look at the private property sign that had been the bane of her existence. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands tight on the wheel of a much older, smaller car. The Range Rover had apparently been part of her personal liquidation to cover her share of the damages. She had tried to treat the world like a HOA meeting where the loudest voice wins by default. She forgot that in the real world, the loudest thing isn't the person screaming at the gate. It's the heavy, final silence of a system that finally works exactly the way it's supposed to. Life at Atlas Freight eventually returned to the kind of routine I'd always preferred: predictable, industrial, and fundamentally quiet. The gravel in the auxiliary lot, which had been churned up by the frantic tires of trapped SUVs and the heavy treads of the yard dogs, finally settled back into its place. We took the opportunity to give the yard a fresh coat of paint. The yellow staging lines, once obscured and ignored by the arrogance of trespassing luxury vehicles, now glowed with a new, sharp intensity against the black asphalt. They stood as a bright, neon reminder of where our world ended and theirs began. I still start my mornings the same way: a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, a fresh page in the ledger, and 10 minutes spent staring out the window of the security shack. The view has changed, though. The houses of whispering pines are still there, their faux stone chimneys poking above the fence line like observers at a border crossing. But the air of frantic entitlement that used to drift over the perimeter has vanished. It's as if the atmosphere itself has been scrubbed clean of Marcia Wayne's influence. The new HOA board has proven to be a group of very fast learners. They don't send decrees, and they don't hold appreciation mornings on our land. They stay on their side of the fence with a discipline that borders on the religious. Sometimes I see a new resident, someone who wasn't there for the Christmas labyrinth, slow their car at our entrance, their eyes drifting toward the wide, open asphalt of our lot. They look at the Pivot property sign, now a massive reflective slab of steel bolted to a reinforced concrete pillar, and they don't see a convenience. They see a $5 million monument to the cost of overreaching. They see the special assessment fee that will be tacked onto their property taxes for the next decade, and they keep driving. I never did bother to correct the local legends that circulated about the night the trailers stood still. In the break room, the drivers still talk about it over stale donuts, their voices full of a quiet, rough-edged pride. To them, it's a folktale of the yard, the night the logistics guy fought back with a kingpin and a dream. To the people in the subdivision, I'm sure it's a ghost story they tell at dinner parties to explain why the neighborhood's planned clubhouse was never built. I don't mind being the villain in their narrative. In logistics, you aren't paid to be liked. You're paid to ensure the system doesn't break. And sometimes that means being the wall that someone else runs into. Sometimes, when the sun is setting and the yard is bathed in that long, amber light that makes the corrugated steel look like gold, I think about Marcia Wayne. I wonder if she's found a new cul-de-sac to colonize, or if she's sitting in some rented apartment drafting bylaws for the hallway. I don't hold any malice toward her anymore. Malice takes energy, and energy is a resource I'd rather spend on freight flow. She was just a person who mistook offense for a suggestion and proximity for permission. She forgot that the world isn't shaped by feelings or visions. It's shaped by permits, deeds, and the sheer physical reality of mass. I set my mug down on the windowsill and pick up the radio. A convoy of 12 rigs is hitting the gate, carrying secured freight that needs to be staged, sorted, and sent out by midnight. The engines are a low, comforting rumble in the distance, a vibration I can feel in the soles of my boots. It's a sound that says the world is still turning, still demanding, and still requiring a place for everything to go. I look at the ledger one last time before the evening rush begins. The inventory is balanced. The trailers are aligned with mathematical precision. The gates are clear. The lines are held. Logistics has no ego. It only has a location. And as long as I'm in this shack, everything will stay exactly where it belongs. And that's Dave's story. Once again, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. It's the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. And let me know in the comments below what you would have done if you were in Dave's situation. See you in the next one.